Okay, so as I say, I've sort of reduced the scope of my talk down to Lesotho. And I'll be talking about education and aspiration from the research project that I'm doing with various colleagues. Actually, I have the team on the next slide, which is focusing on education and aspiration in remote rural areas of India, Lesotho and Laos. So I'm working with 3 co-investigators, Peggy Flora, who's from Brunel, who's taken charge of the India part of it, Roy Huismans from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, who is responsible for the Laos part, and Ian Rivers, who is at Strathclyde, formerly of Brunel, who's in charge of the quantitative element, which we are about to embark on. So it's a 2-year project, 18 months of ethnographic research and interpretation of that, which is coming to an end at the end of this month. And then we've got 6 months to do the quant side of it and carry on working on the ethnographic part really as well. And then we're working with 3 research fellows, 1 for each country, and project partners, so Pulani at the National University of Lesotho, and then 2 NGOs, so a small NGO in India and Plan International in Laos. So a bit of background to this research. There's been a dramatic global expansion of educational enrolment since, well, really as an outcome of the Millennium Development Goals. So by 2005, in sub-Saharan Africa, gross enrolment ratios had reached 97%. But attention has switched to the outcomes of that because there's a statistic going around that there are only 57 million children of school age now out of school, of primary school age, but 250 million who, despite attending school, by the point where they should reach the 4th year of primary education, are still unable to read and write. So it may be that they are still in school and unable to read and write. It may be that they started school and have dropped out and are unable to read and write. So outcomes have become the sort of focus of attention. And those learning outcomes are particularly poor among girls, among young people from indigenous groups and ethnic minorities, and those of lower socioeconomic status and from remote rural areas. So our research focuses on remote rural areas, but also in the case of India and Laos, people from indigenous groups. And actually in Lesotho, we've got the government has suddenly discovered it has ethnic minorities, it has linguistic minorities. And so one of our case studies includes a small number of young people from a linguistic minority. In terms of the focus on aspiration, some have suggested that part of the reason why these groups in particular have lower learning outcomes, I don't know whether that's the right word, is to do with lack of aspiration among the children themselves and their families. The World Bank in particular suggests that, and there is some evidence that disadvantaged groups generally have lower aspirations and as a consequence achieve less in school. And we can connect that with, in terms of theory, with Padurai, who talks about the capacity to aspire and the need for a greater capacity to aspire among the poor in particular, that would enable them, in his view, to contest and alter the conditions of their own poverty. But on the other hand, there's a sort of paradox here, because there's also a lot of evidence come out in recent years that disadvantaged youth actually have unattainably high aspirations. So from the Young Life study, their research in Ethiopia, 75% of poor Ethiopian 14 to 15-year-olds say they would like to have a university degree, and 90% of those say they expect to be able to achieve that. Potentially, clearly they're not going to all get a university degree. So there's a potential there for real disillusionment. And my own PhD research 20 years ago in Lesotho, I did research in a secondary school, particularly with the top 2 years of secondary school, Form D and E. And I communicated with the Form E students a year later to find out what they were doing. And one of them wrote back to me and says, "It feels like I've lost all my parents' money. They paid for me to go to school. I'm now not doing anything. I can't get a job." And Laurent Berlin talks about cruel optimism, by encouraging optimism among young people, we're actually exercising cruelty towards them. So there's a paradox here. On the one hand, the idea that raising that raising aspirations might enhance learning, might enable people to take charge of their own lives, but on the other hand, if that fails, then what are the outcomes? Also, there's evidence that young people leaving school now lack the knowledge and the skills or the willingness, the aspiration to engage in rural livelihoods. Because to them, that would be a failure of their aspirations to engage in sort of agriculture and so on. So there's been quite a lot of different people researching, identifying this de-skilling and loss of ecological knowledge among young people, like Laura Canfield, Sam Punch and Fraser Sugden. And then, perhaps more profound than that, there's the question of whether the global economy can actually absorb and make use of these young people who've been through an education system. Or are they actually just deemed to be waste or superfluous, residual to the economy, and sort of sacrificed as a result of that? There are 2 particular problems with the current state of knowledge that we seek to address in this research. First of all, the conceptualization of aspiration in much research is very narrow. It tends to be one-dimensional. Aspirations are seen as high or low. So the Niels and Durkon paper about aspiration and raising aspiration talks about mothers aspiring to an additional year of schooling for their children. But that's a very sort of narrow conceptualization of aspiration, aspiring to an extra year of education. Aspirations, we suggest, may be concrete or less concrete. They may be stable or very unstable. They're emotionally imbued. They're laden with values. And they may relate to very different types of imagined future. It may be about your family. It may be about your career. It may be about where you live. It may be about what type of person you are. That's all, they're all aspects of aspiration. Then secondly, we know very little about how school systems shape young people's aspirations, or how young people's aspirations shape their engagement with schooling, or with the learning that they achieve. So Baker et al. Say studies have not been able to evaluate robustly the causal relationships between aspirations and outcomes, or identify the full range of mechanisms that shapes them. So that's where our research sits. The aim of the research is to provide insight into how education systems can develop effective policies and interventions that work with young people's aspirations to enhance learning outcomes and address structural disadvantage in remote rural places. We've set out a couple of objectives, one around understanding the mechanisms that connect schooling and aspirations and learning outcomes, another about developing methods that capture that, both qualitative and quantitative methods. And we have 3 research questions. First of all, what roles do 21st century education systems play in shaping young people's aspirations in these remote rural areas? Secondly, how are the aspirations of young people living in remote areas produced in relation to both schooling and the wider social, economic and cultural context? So those are sort of 2 sides of the same relationship, really. And then thirdly, how do young people's aspirations shape their educational engagement and their learning outcomes. So what are the consequences for learning? The settings, 3 settings. Rural Lesotho, which I'll talk about, 2 different districts in Lesotho. Lesotho is a tiny country, so districts there are rather different from districts in India, or in Laos indeed. Udomse province in Laos, particularly among the Hmong ethnic group there, and Chhattisgarh in India. So the Lesotho settings, we have a mountain village. The whole grey area here is mountains. It's all, we're talking areas sort of 2,000 meters plus in altitude. A couple of pictures up there. The village here it's about 3 or 4 hours walk from Maracay Bay, which is like a rural service centre with a secondary school, police station, some bigger shops, a clinic and so on. It's about 12 kilometres from the main tarred, the nearest tarred road, so it's on a little dirt road. There's a taxi, when I say taxi, a minibus service about once a day running along this road. And it's only, actually I haven't said that, but it's actually only about 2 hours certainly once you're onto the road, it's only about 2 hours by bus to the capital city, to Maseru. But it feels quite remote. The second school, I was trying to find somewhere more remote, but it didn't really succeed. So we've ended up with somewhere that feels a lot less remote. But it's certainly further from Maseru. It's probably a good 4 hours drive in a vehicle, 4-wheel drive vehicle from Maseru. In Kuting village, district rather, which was identified, we have a stakeholder group for the project. We've met with them, 3 times, and then we've had a policy workshop last week. That group suggested that we should locate our second case study in this district because it's the most educationally disadvantaged. Its data on learning outcomes is the poorest. And in fact, when we had a meeting in the village, or we attended a meeting and spoke at a meeting last week, 2 weeks ago, in the village, they started off by talking about education, not really involving us at that stage, but was sort of complaining about how this district is the worst for education in the country.
Sorry, can I just ask why that is? Like, is there a specific, is it their linguistic or ethnic?
It is, I mean, they border the Eastern Cape, and there are Xhosa speaking people living along the border. Now they would have liked us to have gone to one of those border schools, and they actually took us, one of the people that actually took us down there to visit a school, but realised that actually the linguistic minority thing was going to be a bit of a problem because our postdoc had learned to speak quite a lot of Sesotho by that stage. And we'd employed a translator, a research assistant for her, who didn't speak Xhosa, so it wasn't really going to work. So we went sort of slightly away from the border, but it's still an area, this area here actually, the people speak, what do they call it, Sepedi, which is a form of Xhosa, but they've been there speaking that language for about 150 years. And they're perhaps more integrated into Lesotho. And the children aren't, whereas down here they were actually teaching partly in Xhosa in the school. In Kuting, where we've been working in the Semapala Valley, the Xhosa speakers are really a minority, and so they're sort of more, in a sense, they're more quickly integrated within school. So the children are actually speaking Sesotho quite quickly after they enter the school, which made it somewhat easier to do research. So there's not a big sort of focus on that really within the research. But that does it. The other issue that they have in the south in Lesotho is drought. So although it's, it's better connected in many ways, it's also more drought prone as an area. But I don't know whether that necessarily has impacts. I mean, it might do. It might do in terms of people's sort of economic situation, makes it more difficult for them to sort of support their children through school. Research methods, we started off with some desk research, and then, as I say, there was sort of nine months of research, ethnographic research, split between the school-based research and community-based. So Claire, who did the research in Lesotho, spent about 4 months in each community, and a few weeks also doing interviews with stakeholders in the policy community in the city in Maseru. So the ethnographic research within the schools included, I said participatory group activities with the students. That happened more outside school, to be honest, but sort of drawing and so on within the school, lesson observation, discourse analysis, a lot of discussion with the kids, looking at curricular exams, interviews with the teachers, and then the community-based research included profiling the villages, first of all, but also just interviews, group interviews with children, parents, other family members, anyone in the community, really. And then what we've just done over the last few weeks is the policy-focused dissemination and feedback workshops. So I think I've got a few pictures of the research methods. So some of these are actually from when I was there in April. I went out for a couple of weeks then and joined in, and we tried out some different activities like ranking different jobs. Write down all the jobs you can think of on bits of paper, and then let's see which one's the most important, least important, which ones would you like to do most, which ones would you least like to do, which ones do you think are the best paid, least paid.
Are you going to talk at all about what those were? I'd be really interested to hear, and how that relates to what you were talking about in terms of their aspirations and the de-skilling of the agricultural workforce. Are there...
Goodness.
I'm putting you on the spot.
You're just sort of challenging my Sesotho.
No, I just wondered more.
I'm just trying to remember. I know that the interesting one was
doctor and engineers.
Sesotho doctor came up as the most important, which we had a bit of discussion about. Sesotho doctor. So a traditional doctor. But none of them wanted to be that. It's somehow a sort of respect, seen as a powerful position, I suppose, in a community. I'm just looking at these. So that is the traditional doctor. This is they want to go somewhere where they make money, and they decided in the end that was a bank, to work in a bank. Teachers came up a few times. Yes, this is a teacher.
Did any of them want to be teachers?
Yes. Yeah. I'll talk a bit more about what they said. I think I'll do that in a bit. Yeah, so we did sort of, this was a drama activity that we did with them. We got them to act out a situation where one of their friends, or one of a group of kids, wants to be, actually it follows on from this, but wants to be a policeman. How do his friends react? How does his teacher react? How do his parents react? Those sorts of things. Yeah. And then this is what we've just been back and we've done dissemination activities. So we've done presentations to the children in school. We took along a little tiny portable projector out of school. So sitting around in the evening when it's got dark, looking at the computer. Let's hear. We did an activity in school where they designed an ideal timetable, what they would like to see in school, how they would like it to be different. We did a bit of drama and video with them. Then we also did presentations to teachers. We actually worked with 3 schools. So the school that was about 40 minutes walk away in the mountain village, and then there was a school in the village, a small school in the village in the Samapala Valley, and another school that's about half an hour's walk away that was a larger school. So we went and talked to teachers there and discussed with them. And we had village meetings in each of the 2 villages, known as pizzos, where the adults come together, and we talked about the research to them and invited discussion.
You might have said that. Were you working with a certain age group of children?
Notionally, I think it's 8 to 22, but we weren't sort of very strict about that. What we decided to do, and I think in the end it probably wasn't quite, it worked in Lesotho but not quite so well in the other countries, was to focus on the top end of primary school on the basis that that is where most kids get to that level, but then many of them drop out following that. But Lesotho, especially in the mountains, they often don't start school until they're 7 because they have to walk a long way. And then there's 7 years of primary school, so they're 14 by the time they get to class 7. In India, they start school at 6 and they do 4 years of primary. And I think we should have focused a bit more on the middle school there. In Laos, it's sort of somewhere between, they do 5 years of primary. But our Laos partner was very keen that we should work with primary schools rather than secondary. So it's a bit of a challenge, that we thought we'd come to a sensible decision at the beginning, but in actual fact, I think in India now, most children go on to middle school. And so I think it would have been sensible to have had middle school so that they end at 8 years of education.
Why would that be the case? Sorry to be asking all these questions, but why would you think that it's middle school where you would have wanted to focus on? Because you feel like aspirations are well developed, they understand usually the concept of
Yeah, that they've thought more about their futures and they're encouraged more to think about it, I think, by the time they get to that stage than they are earlier on in school. And I think, the situation there has changed. Peggy, who's been working in that area for years, but hadn't been back. She went back, but at the point where we actually submitted the application, she hadn't been back for about 8 years. When she did go back, she suddenly found that there was this big change. So in the past, it had always, nobody really had gone beyond primary school, and now they were all going to middle school. Comparison is an important part of the project, although, as I say, I don't feel equipped to sort of do a comparative analysis at this point. But so we have visited each other. So the postdocs in the first instance went and visited each other. So Ashima went from India out to Laos, and this is Steve, who came from Laos to Lesotho and was playing football with the boys in Lesotho, and Claire went to India. And then we've done a similar thing with the co-investigators, travellers going around. So I went to India with Peggy. In fact, I'm visiting all 3. But Roy came from Laos to Lesotho last week, and then Peggy and myself will go to Laos next week. So a few concepts, sort of background, but sort of coming out of the research a bit as well. One thing to sort of stress at the beginning, we talk about, this is supposed to be about remote rural. How remote it is really subject to question. Remote rural is very much a relative thing. Within the communities, there's a very uneven distribution of capacity for mobility. So some people, this Lesotho village, there are some people who are, the Lesotho school, there are some people who travel to South Africa. Some of the children from the village will go to school in Maseru or elsewhere. As I say, I tried to find a more remote village for our second case study, but we didn't manage to set it up while I was there in April, so we just identified a school that looked from its profile to be more remote. And then within a week or so, Claire was saying, well, I've just been talking to the community councillor, and he's recently been to China. The chief had been to Washington sometime in the 1970s. So, when we talk about remote rural, They might feel remote in having, the Lesotho villages have no electricity, no running water, but they're not the most remote within Lesotho, and in some respects they're perhaps not remote at all. But there are characteristics of these schools where the teachers certainly feel in some ways remote. They're remote from even the district offices. They don't get visited very often. In fact, even in our policy meeting, someone was talking there about having been an inspector and going to a school and in the 1980s, and it was, when he looked at the book, it was last inspected in the 1950s. People don't get out to these places very often. That's important in all sorts of ways. One of the ways is it gives the teachers an awful lot of power. So the new curriculum that I'll talk about in Lesotho, where children are supposed to progress automatically from one year to the next and from primary to secondary school, the teacher at this school head teacher was able to say, well, my school's not going to do that. If no one's inspecting, then they have a lot of power. And nobody knows quite what the rules are. There's high levels of absenteeism among both teachers and students. The teachers, again, there's not inspection going on, and they get called away for workshops. I'm not sure about in Lesotho, but in some of the other countries, they get paid to go away for workshops. It's the same issue in those countries as well. And they're not around. And if they go for a workshop for a day, they have to spend a day travelling and a day travelling back. So the contact hours are considerably less in the rural schools than in urban schools. They have fewer resources, things like books, electricity, computers and so on. And what the teachers talk about a lot is their lack of exposure to things that appear in the curriculum. They have a new curriculum, there are all sorts of things that are sketched in the textbooks, which are completely unfamiliar. I hadn't even thought about this, but they were saying, well, children here haven't seen road signs. It's not incredibly remote, 2 hours from the capital city. But if the kids haven't travelled, they haven't seen those things. And certainly not things like computers. Some of them will have because they've got relatives that they travel and see, but many of them haven't.
Sorry, this is completely so incredible though, that actually, we do forget these things. So yesterday...
Is that like...
Yes, your computer's getting angry.
Oh no.
It's all right, I'll shut it down. What is it doing?
So yesterday on BBC, I was watching a program. I can't remember, one of those cooks who goes to the Middle East, and he went to visit this village in Turkey, and the woman in that village, one of the women he visited, she'd only been out of the village once in her life, and I think she was in her mid-70s. So it's actually not something unheard of, that they haven't been out, even out of their village and movement. So
the speaker who was here last week, Paul Lynch, he's doing early childhood development stuff in Malawi. And he was saying something similar about assessing school readiness. And one of the things they do to assess is see if the children will turn the pages in a book and hold the book the correct way. But for some of them, they've never had a book before. So they're given a book, and they said you give it to them upside down and see if they turn it the right way around. But some of them are like, I don't know, I suppose this is how you hold a book, because they haven't had a lot of exposure. So it's interesting, because then it doesn't necessarily mean they're not ready to go into a classroom and learn. They just haven't been exposed to the things that you are measuring. I mean, there are very few books. I mean, you could question the value of literacy in these communities up to a point, but because there's nothing to read. I mean, I'm sure even they have the textbooks in the school, but very, very little besides. Sorry, did I finish that one? No. Oh, just another thing that sort of struck us really is the relationship between the school and the school, or the teacher and the community, is different from in an urban area, because the teacher has a sort of significant role in that community that sets them apart from the community in a way that they wouldn't be set apart in an urban environment. And in both villages, there was one teacher who was born or married into the village.
but even there, they're not really part of the village. They're always outsiders. The school is the institution in the villages. In the policy workshop last week, somebody raised the issue of the church, but in actually here, this building is used as a church. It's a classroom and a church, but there's no resident priest. The priest is 3-4 hours walk away. And the church, I think, is much less prominent than the school and in the community.
And does this school serve a number of villages, or do many villages have
Yeah. So this one is about, this school is half an hour, 40 minutes from the village where Claire was based, where the principal lives. But there are about 5 or 6 other villages a similar distance in other directions. So very few, there's a small number of houses just down here that are probably about 5 households close by the school, but the others are coming in from around. So aspiration clearly is about orientation to the future. We are aware that we can't assume that it means the same thing or that it has the same significance in all the research context. In Lesotho, certainly the future is talked about a lot in relation to children. When people are talking about their children or their grandchildren, they talk about them, you know, that they'll ruin their future if they do that. Or they need to do this for a good future. It's prominent in the discourse of both parents and teachers. There's a word, ditabatabelo, which I'm told translates pretty much directly as aspiration, and it is probably equally not part of common discourse in Lesotho as it is not common discourse in the UK. I actually looked at, I think most of our data is now in Vivo, and I did a word search on it, and I think it only appeared in 3 actual conversations that were recorded. So it's not sort of commonplace term, but at least there is a term, whereas I think in Laos it's really hard to come up with a good translation. We should be conscious that aspirations aren't simply about future careers, they're also about, as I say, about lifestyles, where you should live, what sort of person you should become, particularly values like respect. We've looked quite a lot at the extent, respect is very, very prevalent in speech in the school and the community. It's important to be a respected person. And kids, particularly the younger kids, are quite keen that what they should do in the future is something that is a service to their community, not just for their own interests. So one of the boys says, when I grow up I want to be a police officer and prevent lawlessness in villages in the country, meaning mountains, and prevent corruption and reprimand children.
I love that.
So how does this all relate to motivation? Different cultural contexts, there are differences in the sort of prevalent beliefs about how far the future is something that can be planned for or controlled. Religious traditions have an impact here. Protestantism versus Catholicism, the sort of belief in hard work in Protestantism that sort of says, if you work hard, you will achieve. Pentecostalism is, all about taking control of the future, whereas Buddhism is more about, the future being a reflection of the past. Discourse of modernisation and development, again, is that the more, if you talk about development, that's about envisaging and moving towards a particular future. And again, that between different contexts, there are different ways of explaining success and failure. It might be seen as the outcome of intentional effort, or it might always be seen as the outcome of other things like witchcraft. In Lesotho, hard work is something that is clearly valued, and it's something that we want to explore more in this research, this valuing of hard work, but it's valued primarily because it's seen to lead to a better future. In other societies, perhaps in Laos, it's more something that is seen as an intrinsic good. Children are encouraged to work hard because being hardworking is good in itself. A little bit about education in Lesotho. Historically, it was geared to producing government workers, administrators, police, nurses, and so on. As enrolment's expanded, the number of learners is far in excess of the economy's capacity to provide certainly that sort of jobs, but any sort of formal sector jobs for everybody. So what I'm looking at here really, and what we were looking at as we were working through this last week, was whether young people can be encouraged through education to aspire to alternative livelihoods and lifestyles that perhaps build on those that are already prevalent in rural areas, but perhaps scale those up to make them more productive, more to fulfill a bigger role in the communities. But also, currently those other things are not seen as outcomes of education. Is there a way that education can be seen as not simply about becoming a policeman or a nurse, but can be seen as a way of doing well in these alternative livelihoods? Can it be seen, if Aspiration is going to get kids to engage with schooling, they need to sort of make that connection between schooling and what they might do in the future. So what I'll do is talk through, this is really what we produced about a week ago for our policy meeting, to look at an aspect of the education system, which is how the curriculum gets translated into textbooks and then into teaching and then into messages that go to learners, because there is not a straightforward mapping there. It just gets reinterpreted. But we need to recognise within that young people are also oriented to the future through other aspects of education, including just the very fact that children are moved through, they go to class, or what do they call it there, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. They go to primary, to secondary, to university. There is this sort of progressive structure to the whole education system, which suggests it's going somewhere. It suggests aspiration as an inherent aspect of it. There's also the spatial relationships within the education system. So the relationship with the ministry and the schools that are, spokes of a wheel, if you like, and then further spokes that are the communities around them. And the way that power, information travels through that. The fact that nobody ever comes out from the ministry to the schools, in these rural schools, but the school teachers travel into the ministry. There's a directionality to those relationships. The figure of the rural school teacher, what do they represent? They in themselves represent an aspiration for many. School uniform policies, we had a lot of discussion around school uniform and the way that school uniform is deliberately intended to make the children feel different, to feel that they are not, they are in a different space. Posters on classroom walls that are encouraging them to aspire, motivational messages, or sometimes nothing. Inter-school competitions, that's about aspiration as well in some ways. Assessment practices are always about encouraging, motivating, selecting, about the future. You're working towards something in the future. So curriculum. Now in India, part of the reason I'm not pulling the two together really here is that in India, the conclusions that we came to and what we discussed in the policy meetings was quite different. It was about the need for the curriculum to change, to incorporate more rural sort of life skills, entrepreneurship skills, values, more children-centered pedagogy, more practical skills. Lesotho's done all that. Lesotho brought in a new curriculum, I think it started about 2011, because it's just this last year's grade 7 kids, the top end of primary, were finished, they were the first cohort. So Claire was working with the first cohort to go all the way through with this new integrated curriculum. it emphasises values. Values are there in every subject. They are, if you look at the curriculum, and I'll show you a bit of it in a moment, you'll see that they are there to be focused on and very often assessed throughout the curriculum. Careers are given attention in a whole lot of different subject areas, even right from grade 3 certainly, possibly even, they're even starting talking about jobs in grade 1. It's there. They're often very stereotypical though, which I think the policy people were a bit alarmed when we started showing them pictures from their own textbooks and how this gets interpreted. Entrepreneurship, creativity and entrepreneurship is a subject area in its own right. This integrated curriculum brings together about 13 subject areas that were there in the primary curriculum, puts them into about 6 or 7. One of those is creativity and entrepreneurship. And things like goal setting and planning for the future are there in the curriculum. They're presented as an important skill. So there's an apparent intention here to inspire young people to generate work for themselves that they can engage in rural communities. This is about moving away from education for formal sector jobs alone. Something that's, an academic curriculum, pure academic curriculum. Yeah.
So you mean to say that there is an intention within the curriculum? They're already trying very hard to get young people to remain engaged within rural communities.
I think they really are. I've not got perhaps those bits here to show you, but I just thought I'd show a few clips from different areas. So as I say, when they talk about careers, they end up going back to teaching, nursing, policing, doctor, hairdressing. There's always a skills element to this, information finding, decision making, critical thinking, self-awareness. And values and attitudes always come in to every section. I mean, I loved the bit in the book about assessing kindness. They felt they had to find some way of assessing whether the children were adequately kind and how grading them on their kindness. All these values get assessed, at least in theory. So there's a sort of focus there. There are different activities, there are different types of pedagogy being used. So role play here. Come on to whether it happens or not later.
I like how the teacher also explains the pros and cons of being a teacher.
Yes, yes.
Enlightening for them.
And I'm sure they very happily do that, actually. Entrepreneurship, as I say, it's there. Grade 7, it says learners need to be creative and entrepreneurial in their current and future lives. We need learners who are action-oriented, perseverant, promoting control and autonomy alongside career. I mean, this is a whole sort of neoliberal discourse really around, taking control of your own life. Goal setting. You learn to make decisions, to evaluate, to think about the future, to plan the future, develop a portfolio on their career aspirations. Aspiration, I didn't realise this when we decided to do this research in Lesotho, but it's there already, the sorts of things that we're talking about, which actually just makes it all the more interesting. Whereas in India, we were sort of we effectively suggesting they might do some of these things, and then we go to Lesotho, and I think until I sort of went and sat down and started looking at this the other week and what was really coming out of the research, they're already doing it.
Or it's in the books. It's in the books, or they are doing it.
Well, okay, at the level of curriculum planning, they are. I mean, we can critique what they're doing, certainly, but they are doing things. But then what I wanted to sort of talk through today is how that translates. And I think to some extent the textbooks are really developed in conjunction with the curriculum. They certainly are there to deliver the curriculum, different publishers involved, but I think they've mainly, and again, I haven't looked through the interview, and I think we could have talked more. Unfortunately, the curriculum development people didn't come along to our meeting last week, but I think we could perhaps still talk more with them about exactly how these books are developed. But they do inevitably emphasise some aspects of the curriculum more than others, including through things like illustrations, which are quite often what grab children when they're looking at the books. Values, again, are emphasised in quite a lot of the books. Careers, those that are discussed and illustrated include both formal and, to a lesser extent, informal employment. Entrepreneurship is there in this creativity and entrepreneurship subject area. You know, we get illustrations like this one, you know, which are pointing to very much formal sector sorts of jobs, you know, your doctor, lawyer, designer, journalist. These aren't even jobs that will mean anything actually to any of the children unless they are elaborated on by the teacher. And the teacher may not really know that much about what they're about. Values are there, again, the importance of respect. There's a whole sort of section on respect. This is a grade 3 book, I think. In English, of course, they don't actually, even by the time they get to grade 5, they can't really have a discussion with us in English. Their English is pretty limited. They really struggle because they're not, you know, they're not watching television like those in the city are. But we have things like, we have a shepherd here, which is actually what most of those boys will end up doing, at some point at any rate. Chief, a driver. But this is, you know, this is grade 3, and they're already being told, choose a career for yourself, you know, name other careers you can think of.
They're mostly male.
Oh, did I?
There was a lady,
There's a
who's
teacher
hairdresser.
and a
Oh,
teacher.
teacher.
And they are stereotypically gendered.
Yeah.
Actually, this isn't as, what's the next one that I've got here? Yeah, not as bad as this one, where they're all, the only one that's female is the cook and possibly the astronaut. So where things really become sort of selective is in the teaching. It's an incredibly content-heavy curriculum. I don't know quite what they were thinking of really when they tried to get so much into it. I think there's probably a sense that many children aren't going to go beyond this, so we need to make sure they know everything they could possibly know by the end of primary school. I mean, it's way, way more than I ever did at primary school. So, especially given that there's less contact time than in urban schools, teachers are going to be selective about what they teach. They don't have expertise, they don't have knowledge about some areas. They're getting, I mean, there's all sorts of things in there. There's like playing chess. There are ballroom dances, you know, things that the teachers haven't any idea about and don't really see the point of. They make pragmatic choices based on what they believe will be assessed, even though actually there is no, I won't say there's no assessment, there is assessment, but the children no longer have to pass at the end of grade 7 to get to secondary school. They should progress automatically. But there's still that sort of mentality that we need to teach them what they need in order to pass. And in terms of the pedagogy as well, it's very didactic. So in terms of values, they focus a lot on respect. Careers, they talk mainly about the conventional formal sector jobs, but kids tell us they also talk about agriculture. And actually Claire observed that as well. Entrepreneurship, interestingly, is taught in a very abstract way. So when we started, and I'll come back to, I'll come on to the kids' views in a moment. goal setting, planning the future. There were some examples of teachers actually doing that. I don't know whether it was provoked by Claire sort of asking, when are you going to teach this? So they were asked about goals for Christmas. This comes from the goal setting lesson. And they were taught about SMART goals and different sorts of goal setting. So I think these were probably the kids' own suggestions. But aspiration, of course, isn't just through the lesson content. It's also the pedagogy. It's the way that they are encouraged to show to develop self-esteem. There is some sort of group work, there is some debating and so on, but on the whole, it's mainly didactic teaching. I mean, we actually sat for a morning last week, and there was the first lesson was the teacher talking, and the children writing on the board, and the children writing it down, and then the rest was in silence from answering maths questions from the textbook. When they do group work, they designate leaders. And when we talked to the teachers about that, they said, well, you always have to learn to be a subordinate at some times. So their idea of group work is that there would be a leader and some followers, really, which is, a way of developing leadership skills, I suppose. This enforcement of school uniform, it was, again, the teachers talked about this. The children in, actually this is start of term, they're all very smartly dressed, but in the mountain school in particular, they were told they're not allowed to wear gumboots and blankets and the sort of balaclava hats, which is how they dress for herding. That was banned. They were told, doesn't matter, if your family can't afford the uniform, it doesn't matter so much, so long as you come dressed not as though you're herding. And we were told that this is about setting yourself aside from the village life. You are in a different space here. So in some ways that sort of goes against this idea that you're learning for rural life. So what did the learners think of all this? In terms of values, they talk about respect a lot. They aspire to material things. If they're asked to draw how their life will be in the future, they draw houses, they draw vehicles. They talk about assisting their communities, their families. In terms of careers, I think probably most of them, if you just ask, what do you want to be? 10 years' time, what will you be? They'll say a nurse or a teacher or a policeman or a soldier. It's those 4 jobs. 4 jobs that they see to some extent around them. The other sorts of jobs that get discussed, they don't see. If they're outside school and you ask them, they might say, I'll be a farmer or I'll be a herder. But they're so inconsistent that that when they'll say one thing one week, a different thing another week. These are not deeply held aspirations. There's a sort of sense that we're supposed to say something like this. These are the sorts of jobs that you can choose from. But I don't think they really, and I haven't talked about sort of theory here, but there's a great paper, Zippin et al. Paper, which distinguishes what they call doxic aspirations, which are those that you're supposed to, things that you're supposed to aspire to, and habituated aspirations, those that you really feel inside are what you're going, what's going to happen to you. And I think these are very much sort of doxic aspirations.
Can I ask, you mentioned when they're outside of the school, they might say, I'm probably going to be a farmer. So
they'll talk about, when they talk about jobs outside school,
how they would understand aspirations that you might say, a child might say, I'd like to be a nurse, or it would be wonderful to be a nurse or a policeman or something. But when pushed, they can't imagine themselves outside of the life that they've always lived.
Yeah.
You know, so I wonder. It's really interesting to me, but I wonder how and at what point that kind of breaks when they're like, okay, my dream of being a policeman is.
It's when they leave school, really. I know sometimes even, I mean, I've done research actually with young people in a neighbouring village before, and there's such a difference between what those who are in school talk about and what those who have left school talk about. Even if they're in school and they believe that they're not going to be able to go to secondary school, they still believe that they will be able to at some point, you know, they will go and get a job in a factory and earn the money to go to secondary school to do this thing. Well, this is what they tell you. Once they've left school, they stop talking in those terms. But I think perhaps as they get older, they sort of, in India, Ashima in India was making a sort of case that when the children are young, they have high aspirations in terms of formal jobs and so on, but they have no idea how education links to those, or even whether education is important in them. They have no idea how you get that. As they get older, they sort of begin to grasp the importance of education, but they also recognise that they're not going to get that education that they would need in order to get those jobs, and so they sort of lower their expectations of what they will do.
So that's so interesting, because this is like ages ago when I was doing my own DPhil. I asked in very crude ways about aspirations, and I was looking at 8th graders, girls and boys, in quite an urban setting in one district in Pakistan. And the interesting thing was that when you ask children of that age what they aspire to be these like 6, 7, 8 things, right? They can identify in that setting, they could identify whether their parents could afford, because although this was urban,
okay, that's an interesting question to ask actually.
So they could identify whether they felt that their family was capable, that their parental income was capable for them to actually achieve their aspiration. Many of them said, I don't know to what extent, you know, it was actually true, or in that setting they were saying that. And then they were able to say that, and this is an older age group, 13 to 14-year-olds.
Well, it's the same age as these
and they were also
standard sevens, yeah.
So they could distinguish between what they believed their aspiration was and whether they could actually achieve it or not. They also recognized the value of education in the context I'm talking about. Because they said, yes, I need to complete my middle school and go on to secondary schooling in order to become a doctor, or in order to, but this is an urban setting where you
it's a bit more
it's interesting, right?
better informed.
It's more informed, as you said.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
I think the aspiration level still in the context of India must be quite high for kids of that age, because, you know, they are even older. The ASR survey was done for, I don't know if you follow the ASR, they did the older cohort for the first time, they've released it. And one of the interesting findings was out of this sort of 16 to 17, I think was the age group, they were like something like 80-90% of them said they would like to go on to post-secondary education, although only sort of 20% were able to point to their city on a map of India. So it was like this massive between what they were achieving and their aspirations. So I'm sure that many of those, if pushed, could recognize the flaws in their plan, but their instinct is to say, yes, absolutely, I want to go to post-secondary education. So I think there's so many
That's the same as the Ethiopian kids,
I'm sure it's the same. I think there's just a lot of layers.
But it's, you know, do they believe that? And I think in Lesotho, just from other research, I think if we'd have asked that same question in Lesotho with the grade 7 kids who are still in school, they might have said, no, my parents can't afford it. But if they're still in school, they would say, but I'm going to get there somehow. I'm going to earn the money to go to secondary school for myself. And they would sort of believe that they could do it that way, even though they acknowledge that there's very few sort of proper income earning opportunities for them. When it comes to the sort of entrepreneurship thing, we had a class of kids, they talk about working for themselves, they talk about engaging in agriculture, But they don't connect it at all to what they learn in school. They don't see education as a preparation for it. We had the grade 7s in one of the bigger schools, and started asking them about, if they, in the village, what are the opportunities for making money? And they were just hands shooting up all over the place, and they just they must have come up with at least 20, 30 different ways of making money in the village. But there are also ways of making tiny amounts of money. But they will never talk about those. They just won't see those as, they won't see what they do in entrepreneurship in terms of the sort of business skills that they learn as preparation for that, because they learn it in such an abstract way. So if you start asking them how education might prepare them for those sorts of things, it's about, well, we could learn, maybe we could learn to make pottery in school, but they don't see the wider aspects of entrepreneurship as relating. And again, with the sort of goal setting thing, Claire attended this lesson, and I think it went on for 2 different classes. And she talked to one of the girls who was one of the brightest girls in the class about it a week later, and the girl said, no, I don't remember that lesson at all. And they might, it doesn't mean that they can't describe plans for the future, that they don't plan for the future, that they don't have these ideas. As I say, they'll talk about, well, okay, I'll have to leave school, but I'll go and work in the factory and I'll earn money and I'll go back to school later. They have plans, they have ways of sort of thinking about what they might do, but not in the sort of abstract way that it gets taught. So, to conclude, aspirations, and I haven't developed this as much as I might, but they're produced relationally. They're produced sort of between the school and the community, and between the teachers and the learners. And there are all sorts of aspects of the education system that come together that shape young people's aspirations. But these changes that have taken place in the formal curriculum on their own have only limited impact. Given the role that teachers, particularly in rural areas, and children's own expectations that are shaped by their families, by their communities, the way that they come together, the curriculum isn't doing what the curriculum designers perhaps expected it to. So we would argue that in order to divert their aspirations from this limited range of superficially desired and generally unattainable formal careers, and encourage the idea that school can prepare young people for different sorts of livelihoods, particularly rural livelihoods, interventions need to target the relationships between school and community and between the teachers and the learners. And that's what we tried to get some discussion of in our policy workshop last week.
Thank you very much.